The first faint hint of dawn was not a gentle transition from night to day, but a slow, grim revelation of a nightmare made real. From his concrete emplacement, Widerstandsnest 62, dug into the bluffs of what the Allies would call Omaha Beach, Private Carl Muller watched the horizon bleed. The sea, which should have been empty, was stained a monstrous, unbroken gray. Ships. More ships than his mind could process, a sprawling, silent armada that choked the English Channel from horizon to shore. He was a conscript, a schoolteacher from a small town in Czechoslovakia whose life had been hijacked by the Reich. He was a man who should have been grading papers on European history, not trapped inside its most violent chapter, waiting for the axe to fall. A low, rolling thunder began, a sound so deep it was felt in the bones more than heard by the ears. It was not from the sky. It was from the sea. The battleships were speaking. The world outside his vision slit dissolved into a chaos of pure physics. The cliffs themselves seemed to shudder. Geysers of black earth, sand, and shattered concrete erupted in a terrible, walking dance along the coastline. The air inside the bunker grew thick with the smell of cordite and pulverized stone. Carl crouched low, his hands pressed hard against his helmet, his eyes squeezed shut. This was not the clean, heroic war depicted in the propaganda newsreels they were forced to watch. This was the apocalypse. Then, a new sound carved through the thunder, a high, churning whine that grew into a deafening roar. Landing craft. They hit the sand with a brutal finality, their bow ramps crashing down. And the Americans came out. They did not emerge as an invincible, faceless army. They came as men. Terrified, stumbling men, laden with equipment that dragged them down into the chest-deep, freezing water. They waded into a maelstrom of interlocking machine gun fire that swept the beach like a scythe. Carl watched, his breath caught in his throat, as they were cut down. Whole rows of them fell before they took 10 steps on the sand. He saw men drown under the weight of their packs, saw others torn apart by mortar blasts, their bodies piling up like grotesque flotsam at the water's edge. He was not a soldier in this moment, he was a witness to a slaughter, and a profound, gut-wrenching shame began to curdle within him. He was a watchman in a slaughterhouse, and the gates were open. His orders, drilled into him for months, were simple and absolute: Führer auf die Invasoren. Fire on the invaders. But his finger rested outside the trigger guard of the MG-42. To fire was to paint a target on his bunker for the monstrous guns of the battleships. It was suicide. And more than that, to fire was to personally extinguish the lives of these boys, these men whose individual terror and struggle were so horrifically visible. He saw one soldier, no older than his younger brother, simply sit down in the surf, head in his hands, before being swept away. This was not an enemy, this was a tragedy. As the morning wore on, the battle evolved from a stalled landing into a desperate, bloody crawl. Using the covering fire of a few brave destroyers that risked everything to come in close, small groups of Americans began to inch their way up the draws and gullies. The main focus of the fighting shifted away from his direct sector, moving east towards the Vierville draw. A strange, relative quiet fell over his slice of the beach, punctuated by the constant moan of the wind, the distant crackle of small arms fire, and the cries of the wounded that carried clearly on the air. It was in this eerie lull that Carl saw him. A single American, isolated from the main pushes. He wasn't carrying a rifle, his helmet was marked with a red cross. A medic. The man was desperately trying to drag a wounded comrade towards a disabled landing craft, but a stray burst of mortar fire had found them. The wounded man now lay motionless. The medic, himself clutching a bloody leg, had only managed to collapse behind the steel hull of the craft, trapped and bleeding. From his vantage point, Carl had a perfect, terrible view of the medic's prison. He was in a pocket of dead ground, but to move in any direction was certain death. Karl Muller, the reluctant watchman, now held a single life in his hands. The medic's name was Private Arthur Artie Finch, from a small town in Pennsylvania he would never see again. The world had shrunk to the few square feet of sand behind the cold steel of the landing craft. The initial, searing pain in his leg had subsided into a deep, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with his racing heart. He'd used his last proper bandage to try and staunch the flow, but the crimson stain was still slowly spreading, a dark map of his mortality on the damp wool of his trousers. He was lightheaded, thirst clawing at his throat. He could hear the battle continuing elsewhere, a world away. Here, he was utterly alone, save for the body of the man he couldn't save. He must have drifted off, because the shadow that fell over him was sudden and silent. His eyes snapped open. Standing over him was a German soldier. The enemy. Fear, cold and absolute, lanced through him, cutting through the fog of pain. He fumbled for his .45, his hands clumsy and weak. This was it. This was how it ended, not in a blaze of glory, but executed in a ditch, but the German wasn't raising his rifle. He stood perfectly still, his hands empty and held slightly away from his body. His uniform was dusty, his face young, etched with a tension that wasn't hatred, but something else, anxiety, perhaps even fear. He slowly, deliberately, knelt and placed a canteen and a small cloth bag on the sand between them. Then, he shuffled backwards several paces on his knees, his hands still visible. "Wasser," the German said, his voice low and rough. He pointed to the canteen. Then he mimed the act of wrapping a bandage around his own leg. Verbund. Artie stared, his mind refusing to process the scene. This was a trick. It had to be. But the German remained kneeling, his expression one of intense, silent pleading. He pointed again at Artie's leg, then at the bag, and made a drinking motion. The logic was undeniable. If he wanted Artie dead, he would already be dead. The fear began to recede, replaced by a bewildered, dawning comprehension. He gave a single, shallow nod, his hands trembling. Artie reached for the canteen. The water was the most profound thing he had ever tasted. It was life itself. He then opened the bag. Inside was a German field dressing and a small, wrapped piece of dark bread. With clumsy, grateful hands, he set to work. He poured the sulfa powder from the dressing onto the wound, the sting a welcome jolt of reality, then tightly wrapped the bandage. The German, Karl, watched him the entire time, his eyes constantly flicking towards the bluffs, a silent sentry standing guard over this most fragile of truces. For 10 minutes, the war ceased to exist. There was no Omaha Beach, no Third Reich, no Allied invasion. There were just two young men in a scar in the earth, one tending his wounds, the other ensuring he could. No words were spoken, none were needed. The simple, human acts of offering water and administering aid had built a bridge across an ocean of ideology and violence. Artie finished, the new bandage holding firm. He looked at Karl, and for the first time, he truly saw him not as a Nazi or a Jerry, but as a person, a scared kid just like him, trapped in the same colossal, grinding machine. He nodded again, a gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "Thank you." "I understand." Karl understood the nod. He pointed a firm finger towards the American lines, now several hundred yards away up the beach. Then he held up a hand, all 5 fingers splayed. He pointed to his own eyes, then swept his hand towards the German positions further inland, and finally drew a finger sharply across his own throat. The message was clear, a desperate piece of tactical sign language. I will watch that way for 5 minutes. The path behind you is clear. Go. Now, Artie Finch, his strength somewhat returned, used his rifle as a crutch and pushed himself to his feet. The pain was still there, a bright, hot fire in his leg, but it was a pain he could manage. He took one last look at the German soldier who had, against all odds, chosen to be his savior. There was nothing to say. He turned and began to hobble, slowly and painfully, away from the landing craft, towards the smoke and the distant sounds of his own people, leaving the watchman alone once more. Karl Muller watched the medic until he was nothing more than a limping speck, swallowed by the rubble and smoke that choked the exit from the beach. A profound silence settled around him, broken only by the ever-present wind and the distant, muffled thunder of the war. He had done it. He had stepped outside the machine, if only for a few minutes. The weight of the canteen and bandage was gone from his pack, replaced by a different, heavier weight, the burden of what he had done, and the terrifying fragility of the humanity he had just affirmed. That he turned and began the careful climb back up the hidden goat path, his senses screaming. Every rustle of grass, every scuff of his boot on stone, felt deafening. If a German patrol saw him returning to his post from this direction, the consequences would be immediate and fatal. Fahnenflucht. Desertion. A bullet to the back of the head. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of treason. He reached the bunker's rear entrance, a low, reinforced door meant for resupply or escape. He slid inside, the cool, dank darkness of the concrete embracing him. He threw the heavy bolt, the metallic clunk echoing in the small space, sealing himself back into his assigned role. That he picked up his MG-42. The metal was cold and familiar. He resumed his position at the vision slit, his eyes scanning the same terrible panorama. The bodies were still there. The burning wrecks were still there. But something had shifted. The beach was no longer just a tactical problem or a killing zone, it was a graveyard filled with individuals, each with a story as complex and abruptly ended as the medic's nearly was. He saw the landscape now with the medic's eyes, not as a defender, but as a man fighting for his life in an impossible situation. The battle for Omaha Beach would rage for the rest of the day. Karl would hear the fighting move inland, the crackle of small arms fire coming from the bluffs above him. He would spend the hours in a state of heightened alert, not for the enemy, but for the sound of German boots approaching his bunker, for the accusation that would end him. But none came. To the wider war, Private Karl Muller was still a loyal soldier, manning his post. As dusk began to settle, staining the sky a bruised purple, the sounds of battle finally began to fade, replaced by the moans of the wounded and the relentless crash of the waves. The Americans had taken the beach. They were digging in on the bluffs. Karl was now behind enemy lines, a forgotten sentry in a captured position that he knew he would be found in the morning. When the American sweep teams cleared the bunkers, they would find him. He laid his rifle down on the floor, away from the embrasure. He would not fight. He would not give them a reason to throw a grenade into his dark hole. He sat in the corner, wrapped in a gray army blanket, and waited. When the light of the new day filtered in, and the cautious footsteps of American soldiers finally sounded at his door, Karl Muller did not reach for a weapon. He simply stood up, his hands high above his head, and walked out into the light, a prisoner of war. He had never fired his machine gun on D-Day. He had not changed the course of the battle. But for one man, on the blood-soaked sand of Omaha Beach, he had been the difference between life and death. In the grand, brutal ledger of war, his single act of mercy was a tiny, insignificant entry. But for Karl, and for Artie Finch, it was everything. He had been more than a soldier for the Reich, he had been a watchman for a single, flickering spark of grace in the overwhelming darkness. The frozen gauntlet. The world was a featureless, blinding white. At 25,000 feet over Germany, the temperature was 40 degrees below zero, a cold so profound it felt like a physical presence, seeping through the leather and wool of their flight suits, making the very metal of the B-17 flying fortress groan in protest. The bomber, named Fortitude by her crew, was a wounded bird struggling to stay in the sky. Captain Jack "Lucky" Lewis gripped the controls, his knuckles white, his breath pluming in the frozen cockpit. The mission to bomb the Focke-Wulf factory at Marienburg was supposed to be a maximum effort strike. It had turned into a massacre. An hour ago, they had been part of a majestic, terrifying armada, a sky full of fortresses holding formation. Then the Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s found them. The German fighters had come in from every angle, ignoring the screen of P-51 Mustangs to tear into the bomber stream. Fortitude had taken the brunt of it, protecting the lead ship. A cannon shell had ripped through the plexiglass nose, killing their young bombardier, Smitty, instantly. Another had torn a gaping hole in the left wing, shearing away part of the aileron. A third had knocked out their No. 3 engine, which now trailed a thick, oily smoke that was a beacon for every fighter in the Reich. Pilot to crew, sound off. Jack's voice was tight, strained over the intercom. Co-pilot, I'm okay. That was Lieutenant Miller, his face pale but steady. Navigator here. Charts are a mess, but I've got a fix. Lieutenant Abrams, the navigator, was already trying to plot their crippled journey home. Radio's gone, Skipper. Took a direct hit. Sergeant Davis's voice was grim. Top turret operational. That was Sergeant O'Malley, the flight engineer. But we've got a fire in No. 3. Trying to shut it down and feather the prop. The plane shuddered violently as O'Malley worked to kill the dead engine. Jack fought the controls, the Fortitude pulling hard to the left. Through the gaping hole in the nose, he could see the endless, hostile landscape of Germany below. They were alone. The rest of the formation, what was left of it, had disappeared ahead, unable to slow down for them. They were a straggler, the most vulnerable thing in the sky. Ball turret, you okay down there? Jack asked, a knot of fear in his stomach. The ball turret was a death trap, a tiny glass sphere hanging beneath the fuselage. A weak, staticky cough came over the intercom. Ball turret. I'm hit, Skipper. Can't feel my leg. It's real cold. The voice belonged to Private First Class Riley, the youngest member of the crew. A fresh wave of dread washed over Jack. The ball turret was impossible to enter or exit in flight. Riley was trapped down there, wounded, exposed to the freezing slipstream and any fighter that decided to finish them off. Their home base in England was a lifetime away, across hundreds of miles of enemy territory, and they were losing altitude, fuel, and blood with every passing second. The mission was over. The only mission that remained was survival. They had to run a frozen gauntlet back to friendly skies, and the odds were stacked impossibly against them. O'Malley, get that fire out. Miller, help me hold her level. Jack barked, his voice the only thing cutting through the howl of wind rushing through the shattered nose. The Fortitude was a dying beast, and he was its fading will. He could feel the sluggish response in the controls, the constant, heavy pull of the damaged wing. They were descending slowly but inexorably, a sinking ship in an ocean of sky. I'm trying, Captain. The extinguisher didn't work. O'Malley yelled back from the top turret. The fuel line must be severed, it's feeding the flames. Through his side window, Jack could see the ominous orange glow licking at the base of the dead engine's nacelle. If that fire reached the fuel tank in the wing, it would be over in a spectacular, fiery instant. They had seconds. Abrams. What's below us? Jack shouted to the navigator. Farmland, skipper. Small villages. No major flak concentrations on the map, but that doesn't mean a thing. It was a desperate gamble. Miller, we're going down. Push the nose over. O'Malley, brace yourself. We're going to dive and try to blow that fire out. Jack shoved the control column forward. The B-17's nose dropped, and the bomber screamed towards the earth. The G-forces pressed them into their seats. The wind roar became a shriek. Out the window, the fire on the wing flared violently, then began to shrink, starved of oxygen by the increased air pressure. They plummeted from 25,000 feet to 10,000 in a matter of minutes, the German landscape rushing up to meet them with terrifying clarity. Fire's out. O'Malley confirmed, his voice shaking with relief. Jack pulled back on the yoke, leveling out, his heart hammering against his ribs. They were now low, vulnerable to small arms fire from the ground, but they had cheated one death. The reprieve was short-lived. Fighters. 5 o'clock high. The call came from the waist gunner. Looks like a pair of 109s. They're peeling off. The two Messerschmitts, having spotted the wounded straggler, dove on them like hawks. Tracers streaked past the cockpit. The Fortitude shuddered as its own .50 caliber machine guns opened up in response, a stuttering, defiant roar from the top turret, the tail, and the waist positions. Jack threw the heavy bomber into a series of violent, evasive maneuvers, skimming over the rooftops of a German village, using the terrain as cover. Riley! Riley, can you hear me? Jack yelled into the intercom, thinking of the boy trapped in the ball turret, being thrown around like a marble in a cup. That a pained groan was his only answer. The battle was a blur of noise and motion. One of the 109s, overconfident, flew too close to the tail gunner's field of fire. A sustained burst ripped into its engine, and it trailed smoke, breaking off and diving away. The other, more cautious, made another pass, its cannon shells ripping into the already damaged left wing but failing to find a critical system. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The second fighter, perhaps low on fuel or ammunition, broke away and disappeared. Silence descended, more unnerving than the attack itself. The Fortitude flew on, a ghost ship trailing smoke and grief. They had survived the fighters, but the cold was now their most insidious enemy. The gaping holes in the fuselage let in a deadly chill. Riley, in his exposed ball turret, was in mortal danger from hypothermia and blood loss. Their navigator had a rough course for home, but they were alone, wounded, and freezing, with a long, long way to go. The gauntlet was far from over. The inside of the Fortitude was a frozen hell. The wind whipped through the cabin with a biting, razor-sharp edge. Ice coated the interior walls, and the crew's breath hung in the air in permanent, frosty clouds. They were flying over the North Sea now, the gray, churning water, a sight that should have brought relief but only offered a new kind of terror. Ditching in that would mean certain death in minutes. Riley's not responding, skipper. O'Malley's voice was hollow over the intercom. He had managed to crawl back to the waist and look down through the small scuttle hole into the ball turret. He's unconscious. I can see ice on his suit. Jack Lewis felt a lead weight settle in his chest. They had come so far. They had navigated by dead reckoning through flak pockets and fighter screens, the navigator, Abrams, performing miracles with a damaged sextant and a prayer. They had nursed their failing fuel gauges, the 3 remaining engines drinking the last of their precious reserves. To lose Riley now, when England was so close, was an unbearable thought. "O'Malley, is there any way? Any way at all to get him out?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. "Negative, Captain. The mechanism is jammed solid with ice. It's a tomb down there." A tense, grim silence filled the intercom. There was nothing to do but fly. The English coastline appeared as a thin, brown line on the horizon, the most beautiful sight Jack had ever seen. But their trials weren't over. "Fuel warning light on number 2 engine." Miller called out. "Switch to the crossfeed. Use the last from the reserves." Jack ordered, his eyes fixed on the coast. They were so close, number 2 engine sputtered, coughed, and fell silent. The Fortitude lurched. They were now flying on 2 engines, the plane struggling to maintain altitude. They were losing height fast, the white cliffs of Dover growing larger, too large, too fast. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." Jack yelled into his radio, hoping against hope it was working. B-17 Fortitude, 2 engines out, critically damaged, attempting to ditch off the coast of Dover. Crew of 9, 1 critical wounded. They crossed the coastline at barely 500 feet. Below them, people on the ground pointed up at the stricken bomber. Jack picked what looked like a relatively smooth field just beyond a small village. It was their only chance. "Brace for impact. Everyone brace." Jack cut the remaining engines. The sudden silence was deafening. All he could hear was the whistle of the wind through the bullet holes. He flared the massive aircraft, pulling the nose up, trying to bleed off speed. The landing gear, damaged and untested, sheared off instantly as they hit the field. The Fortitude slammed into the English soil with a terrible, grinding shriek of tearing metal. It skidded forward, plowing a deep furrow in the earth, before lurching to a stop, tilted sharply on its damaged wing. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the crew began to move, coughing in the dust, checking each other for injuries. They had made it. They were home. The rescue came quickly, farmers with axes, then Home Guard soldiers, then an ambulance. They worked for an hour with cutting torches to free Riley from the frozen ball turret. He was alive, but barely, his body blue with cold, his leg a mess. But he was alive. As Jack stood on the solid, blessed ground of England, watching his crew being helped away, he looked back at the Fortitude. It was a wreck, a twisted skeleton of aluminum and steel. It would never fly again. But it had held together. It had carried them through the frozen gauntlet. They had lost Smitty, and Riley was gravely wounded, but 8 men were walking away because of the fortitude of the machine, and more importantly, of the men inside her. The mission was a tactical failure. But their return was a profound, human victory. The bridge at Remagen. The Rhine River was more than a body of water. It was a myth, a psychological fortress, the last great natural barrier into the heart of the Third Reich. For the weary, mud-stained men of the U.S. 9th Armored Division, it was the final, seemingly insurmountable obstacle after a long, bloody push from the Normandy beaches. From the high ground overlooking the town of Remagen, Lieutenant Joe Phelps scanned the river through his binoculars. His platoon was part of the spearhead, exhausted and under strength, but they still had fight left in them. And then he saw it. Through the morning mist, it was a gray, skeletal silhouette against the green hills on the eastern bank, the Ludendorff Bridge. And it was still standing. "Sergeant, do you see what I see?" Phelps whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. Sergeant Mike "Gunny" Gunderson, a veteran who had fought from North Africa to the Ardennes, lowered his own binoculars. A slow, grim smile spread across his grimy face. I see it, Lieutenant. The Krauts forgot to blow their back door. The intelligence was clear. German High Command had issued explicit orders. Every bridge across the Rhine was to be demolished to stop the Allied advance. The Ludendorff Bridge, a vital railway bridge, was scheduled for destruction. But as Phelps watched, he could see a disorganized stream of German troops, a mix of regular army, conscripted Volkssturm, and even some Hitler youth, still retreating across it. They were a beaten army, and in their desperation to escape, they had delayed the inevitable. Get on the horn to battalion, Phelps ordered his radio men. Tell them we have visual on an intact bridge at Remagen. I repeat, the bridge is still intact. Requesting immediate orders and armor support. While they waited, Phelps and Gunderson planned. The bridge was a death trap. It was over 1,000 feet long, with massive stone towers on the western end. The eastern bank was a steep, heavily forested cliff, perfect for defensive positions. If the Germans had any fight left in them, crossing that bridge would be a suicide mission. But the prize was unimaginable, a foothold on the east bank of the Rhine. It could shorten the war by months, save tens of thousands of lives. Back at the German headquarters in a bunker on the eastern cliff, Captain Karl Schmidt, a weary but dutiful Wehrmacht engineer, was facing his own nightmare. His orders were to blow the bridge at 4 p.m., once the last of the retreating troops were across. But the demolition charges, hastily and poorly installed by a panicked unit days before, were faulty. The primary electrical detonator was unreliable. His men were laying backup primer cord, but it was slow, dangerous work under the watchful eyes of American artillery spotters. Phelps's radio crackled to life. The voice from battalion was strained, urgent. Thunderbolt 6 to Greyhound 1. Your message received. Confirmed. That bridge is your objective. Take it. I repeat, take the bridge. Do not let them blow it. All available forces are being rerouted to your position. Move now. Out. Phelps looked at Gunderson. The sergeant nodded. There would be no waiting for armor. All right, listen up. Phelps yelled to his platoon. We're going for that bridge. First and second squads, you're on point. Suppress any fire from the towers. Third squad, with me. We're going straight down the middle. We have to get across before they blow it to hell. As the men checked their gear, a deep, guttural explosion echoed from the eastern bank. A plume of smoke and dirt erupted at the base of the bridge. The Germans had triggered their charges. But as the smoke cleared, Phelps's heart leaped into his throat. The bridge shuddered, but it held. The main explosive charge had failed. The bridge was wounded, but still standing. The race was on. The failed demolition was a gift from God, but the Germans weren't finished. As Phelps's platoon advanced cautiously through the streets of Remagen towards the western approach, a storm of machine gun and sniper fire erupted from the twin stone towers guarding the entrance. The Americans dove for cover behind rubble and shattered buildings. The bridge, which had seemed like a promise, now looked like a mile-long funnel of death. Gunny, we're pinned down. Phelps yelled over the crackle of gunfire. We need to clear those towers. On it, Lieutenant. Gunderson, moving with a predator's grace, gathered a handful of men from first squad. Jenkins, Thompson, with me. We'll work our way around the left flank. Grenades and satchel charges. The rest of you, give us covering fire. While Gunderson's team began their dangerous assault on the nearest tower, Phelps coordinated with the rest of his platoon and the few other units that had managed to arrive. A Sherman tank, its engine roaring, clanked into position and began firing its 76mm gun directly into the tower's embrasures, the concussions shaking the very ground. Under this heavy cover, small groups of infantry, including Phelps and his men, began a desperate, sprinting dash onto the bridge itself. The world narrowed to the wooden railway ties under their feet and the steel girders whizzing past. Bullets sparked and ricocheted off the metalwork with an unnerving ping-zing. Mortar shells dropped into the river below, sending geysers of water high into the air. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, river damp, and fear. Men fell, some tumbling over the side into the cold, swift current of the Rhine. There was no time to stop for them. The only direction was forward. On the eastern bank, Captain Schmidt was in a frenzy. The main charge failed. Use the backup. Blow the primer cord, he screamed at his engineers. A German soldier lit the fuse on the emergency explosive train, a line of primer cord that would hopefully trigger the remaining charges. The sputtering fuse snaked its way towards the bridge's critical structural points. At that moment, Sergeant Gunderson and his men burst into the ground floor of the western tower. The close-quarters fighting was brutal and swift, a storm of grenades, submachine gun bursts, and bayonets. Within minutes, the tower was silenced. But the fight for the bridge was happening in the open. Phelps, leading from the front, was halfway across when he saw it, the flickering, terrifying spark of the backup fuse, racing along a girder just ahead of him. Without a second thought, he raised his M1 Garand and fired, again and again, at the snaking fuse. Other soldiers saw what he was doing and joined in, a desperate volley of rifle fire aimed at a tiny, moving target. The air was filled with the crack of their rifles. The fuse sputtered, jumped, and then, miraculously, was severed. The spark died. A massive cheer went up from the Americans on the bridge. They had won the second round. But the Germans still held the eastern cliff, and now they were pouring every weapon they had onto the bridge. The crossing had become a bloody, slow-motion nightmare, with every yard paid for in lives. They were so close, yet the final 100 yards seemed like an impossible distance. The final push across the Ludendorff Bridge was a test of pure, raw courage. The German defenders on the far bank, now reinforced and enraged by the failed demolitions, had zeroed in their artillery and mortars. The bridge deck was a hellscape of twisted metal, pockmarked with craters, and littered with the fallen. Lieutenant Phelps, his uniform torn and face smudged with soot, felt a bullet graze his helmet, knocking him to his knees. For a moment, the world swam. He saw Sergeant Gunderson, a few yards ahead, hauling a wounded man to cover, his own arm bleeding from a shrapnel wound. "We can't stop now," Gunderson roared, his voice cutting through the din. "One more push. For the guys behind us." That was the key. This was no longer just about taking a bridge. It was about securing a corridor. If they failed, every man who had followed them onto this death trap would be slaughtered. Phelps pushed himself up, his head ringing. He looked at the faces of the men around him, terrified, exhausted, but resolute. "On my signal," Phelps screamed, raising his rifle. "Fix bayonets. We're going to charge them." It was an act of sheer, audacious will. The order was passed down. With a series of metallic shings, bayonets were fixed to rifles. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. The sight of a bayonet charge, something from a bygone era, was meant to break the enemy's spirit. "Let's go. Forwards." Phelps yelled, and he led the final, desperate sprint. They ran, a screaming, determined wave of men, into the teeth of the German defense. They fired from the hip, threw grenades, and closed the distance with a fury that seemed to stun the defenders. The fighting on the eastern approach became a vicious, close-range melee. But the American momentum was unstoppable. They overran the German machine gun nests at the bridge's exit, one by one. Captain Schmidt, watching from his command post, saw the tide turn. He gave the order to fall back to secondary defensive lines further up the cliff. The bridge was lost. The Americans had done the impossible. As the last shots echoed away, an eerie quiet fell over the bridge. Phelps leaned against a shattered girder, gasping for air. He looked back across the Rhine. The bridge, though damaged and scarred, stood. And across its length, a steady stream of American soldiers was now pouring, securing the eastern bank, establishing the first Allied foothold on the German heartland. They had paid a terrible price. The deck was stained with blood, and the cost in lives had been high. But they had done it. Sergeant Gunderson walked up to him, holding a bloody field dressing to his arm. "We got it, Lieutenant," Gunny said, his voice thick with exhaustion and pride. Phelps just nodded, too spent for words. He looked at the bridge, this symbol of German engineering that had become a monument to American courage. The war wasn't over, but a pivotal battle had been won. The Rhine had been crossed. The road to Berlin was now open. The bridge at Remagen was no longer just a structure of steel and stone, it was a testament to the men who refused to let it fall.